Okay, here in Photoshop, let's talk about the Tools bar. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is make a new canvas and just say, okay, I'll talk about the ins and outs of making canvases later in this lesson. So this is just a random canvas because I'll have to demonstrate this stuff on a canvas after all. So digital software has to begin with the brush tool, which is right there. If you hover your mouse over these tools, Photoshop sort of gives you this animated icon to tell you what it is. Now, if you click and hold that brush tool, it'll give you some other options. And the first thing I want to say is you should just completely ignore the pencil tool. No one ever uses that. Now you might be like, well, how do I get a pencil and draw? Well, you use the brush tool just with a pencil brush. Our brushes, as you recall, are over here. Now I'm going to cover this window in the next chapter, but essentially with the brush tool active, you can just pick any brush and start painting with it. And if you wanted to say draw, you would just pick a pencil style brush, say like this one, and just draw this way. So the brush tool goes hand in hand with the brushes you have at your disposal, which can number in the hundreds or thousands. In Photoshop, if you hold Shift, it will make a vertical line or a horizontal line. Also, if you say make a little dot, hold Shift and click again, it'll draw a direct line between the two. Your brush opacity and flow is at the top. This is basically determines how opaque the stroke is. So at 100%, I have a fully opaque stroke. If I reduce the opacity to say 50% or something, it's 50% opacity. As you can see, let me just select a red color. You can see that right now it's 50% opacity, so you can see those other brush strokes through it. Whereas if I brought it up here, you'd have more opaque strokes that just go over top of everything. Now, the opacity of most brushes is also controlled by how hard you're pressing with your stylus. So the opacity setting represents what you can achieve at 100% pressure on your stylus. Flow is similar, although I usually don't adjust flow too much. I usually just stick with opacity. Flow kind of mimics how an airbrush works, like if you pushed and held how much paint would come out at what rate. It's a bit weird, and honestly, I just don't really use it that much. Okay, so the opposite of the brush, I suppose, is the eraser, which is right there. Now, the eraser in Photoshop erases back to the background color. This is the foreground color, this is the background color. You can swap them with this little handy arrow here. And you can pick different background colors. So if I picked a blue background color, when I erase, it's going to go toward blue. This behavior can be modified as we start introducing layers, but again, I'm going to section that off into a different chapter. Erasers can have brushes just like the brush tools can, so I can have an eraser shaped like whatever this is, some kind of dotty thing. And of course, if you hold on the eraser tool, you have different kinds of options, but I usually just stick with the eraser tool. If you're using a tablet, the other side of your pen usually has an eraser on it, and you can use that as well. In that case, you can still be on the brush tool. Like right now, I have the brush tool active, making some strokes. Then I'll flip the stylus so the eraser is touching the tablet. And as you can see, I'm erasing while the brush tool is active. As you are using the brush tool, you're going to want to change your color. Now, of course, you can do that here. Or if you want a color that's already existing in your painting, like let's say I want to get the mixture of that blue with that red, push and hold Alt, and it turns into this eyedropper with which I can select a new color. The top half of that updating circle is the new color I'm selecting, and the bottom half is the color I previously had. So, I can just let go and paint with that new color now. And this is something I'll often do. I'll often, make a few brush strokes, sample the mixture, and then paint with that new color. It's a common approach that I use. And when you sample colors like this, it also, of course, updates on your color picker over here. The size of the brush can be changed up here by sliding around the size parameter, or it can be changed in the brush window here by sliding the same size parameter. If you slide it here, it also updates here. As you can see, they're both live in sync together. It's the same slider. But no one really uses that. The shortcut key is the square bracket keys. So the right square bracket increases your brush size, the left square bracket decreases the brush size. When I paint in Photoshop, my fingers are glued to those square bracket keys because I'm constantly changing brush size as I work. And already we've hit kind of a landmark in this class. If you're getting started with digital painting, if you're brand new to it, just with what we've covered so far in this class, you could paint. You don't need anything else. Just grab a brush, grab a new canvas, make your interface look how you want it, something like this, and just go ahead and paint something. I painted some weird abstract thing here, but this could be a human portrait if you wanted it to be. And don't worry, we'll actually do a real painting later on in this class. But for now, let's look at some of the other tools in this toolbar. You'll probably be doing a lot of zooming when you paint digitally. The magnifying glass tool is right there. And by the way, when you have these little animated icons, Photoshop also gives you the shortcut key. So the shortcut here is Z. Clicking on the zoom tool though, I could just press and hold and zoom in and out, or you can just click once and it'll zoom in to a certain degree. If you hold Alt, it turns into a zoom out and you can click, but my preference is just to simply click and drag, which allows you to zoom in and out. When you're zoomed in, you can hold the space bar and move around your painting. This is also where that navigator window comes in. You see this blue box that indicates how far we're zoomed in. Without pushing spacebar, you can simply click and drag around. This accomplishes the same thing. You also have a little zoom bar down here. So a lot of times these windows are tied into the toolbar here. If you look at this number here, Photoshop tells you how zoomed in you are. A quick way to zoom back out to 100% is just double tap on the magnifying glass tool. Let's talk about this little guy right here. This is the eyedropper tool. As you can see from the animated diagram, the eyedropper tool samples colors. Now, we already talked about doing that with the brush tool active and holding Alt. This activates the eyedropper tool. And this is the best way to do it because you don't have to switch tools. However, if you do switch to the eyedropper tool, you have a few options you can enable up here. By default, the eyedropper tool is set to point sample. This means it'll select the color of the pixel that I'm on. That can be a bit frustrating though, because sometimes you want to sample sort of a general mixture of an area. To do that, simply click here and go to say 11 by 11 average. That will give me an 11 by 11 area of pixels, and it's almost like picking colors off a traditional painting palette. You know, where you have more of an area of color that you're selecting from. You can change it to be larger or smaller. And then again, what I like to do is go back to the brush tool and access the eyedropper by just clicking Alt. And doing so will respect the setting you have selected here. I recommend keeping the sample mode as it is, set to all layers. There are times when you want to change that, but that gets into more technical territory, which I don't think we need to cover right now. Moving on to another tool, let's talk about the crop tool, which is right there. And Photoshop's animated little graphic there gives you an idea of what the crop tool does. What I like to do is make sure I'm zoomed out, then grab the crop tool and simply click and drag to your desired cropping. And then you can use these handles to make little adjustments, and when you're done, just push Enter, and you've cropped your image. I should also mention the undo feature. Just like any other software, it's Edit, Undo, Crop. Another feature you might want to adjust if I just remade that crop, go to this gearbox tool and turn up the opacity, and it will hide the painting that you're eventually going to crop out. This will probably allow you to preview your crop a little bit better. Then as you're dragging these handles around, you can see your painting once again. Another thing you could do is set custom ratios. So like a 5:7 ratio is a common ratio for photographs. If I click that, Photoshop will automatically give me that 5:7, which I can adjust to any size I want, including horizontal, of course, while keeping that aspect ratio 5:7 intact. And I'll just push Ctrl Z a few times to undo a few steps there. You notice I have my 5:7 cropping selected. You can just push the clear button and now I'm back to freehand cropping. Just to provide a little context here, I do use the crop tool a lot in my art. Sometimes I'll be painting a composition and I just don't need like a little bit on the side. So like I'll select the crop tool and just kind of go like this, push Enter, and I've got my new cropping. You can also add canvas space with the crop tool. If I click and select everything and then drag this out like this, I've now added more space. It's green because my background color is green. And that's how the crop tool works. It'll automatically fill your new space with whatever your background color is set to. Okay, but I'll undo to get our main image back, and let's move on to the next tool, which is the selection tool up here. By default, it's the square. If you press and hold, you have access to elliptical or circles or single rows or single columns. Let's just go to the main one, which is the rectangular marquee tool, which I just call the selection tool. With this tool, we can, of course, make a selection and then do all kinds of things within that selection. The first thing I could do, if I press B for brush, I could paint inside that selection. Another thing I could do is access Photoshop's filters by going to Filter, say Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I can blur just that selection. Hitting OK if I were happy with that, but I'll hit Cancel because I don't actually want to blur that. Another thing you could do here is access the Move tool, which is this guy right here, and move this selection around. If I want to deselect that, I could either push Ctrl D, or simply click on the selection tool here and click out like that. And I'm free to make all kinds of selections just by clicking and dragging. Of course, if you want to multi-select, hold Shift, and now I can make 2 selections. I could also click into the elliptical one and make elliptical selections, still holding Shift here to add to my selections, and do all the same stuff within those selections. I'll push Ctrl D to deselect that. With the elliptical tool, if I hold shift, I can make a perfect circular selection. And the same is true with the box. If I went back to the box one and held shift, I could make a perfect box selection. Once I have a selection like this, I could push Control T to access the transform tools. And now I can do many different operations. Any of the handles will turn into a scale tool, and I can scale from different points, as you can see. Holding Control on one of these points will allow me to skew it. This can help with perspective or many different things. One unfortunate feature of this window is the undo key only works once. So I actually can't get this back to where it was. To get it back, I'd have to press Enter to commit to it, and then undo, and it'll undo the whole thing. It's kind of weird that way. But pushing Control T again, I could hover my mouse just above the corner and it turns into this rotation icon, and this will allow me to rotate it. And finally, I could right click inside the box and I can access all those things, including this warp tool, which gives me a little grid with which I can warp my image around. Also very handy when you're working on a complex drawing and you just want to tweak something. And again, pushing Enter to commit to that. And then once you have it, you can push Control Z to undo everything. Another way to make a selection is with this tool, the lasso tool. By default, it'll be on this one. This is the freehand lasso tool, so I can make a selection like that. It acts the exact same way as the box one we just saw, or you can hold and go to the polygonal lasso tool, which will allow you to draw points like this, clicking the mouse at each point, pushing Enter when you're done to make the selection. And again, holding Shift will allow you to multi-select just like before. You can also double tap to end a selection like so. Holding the Alt key will allow you to eliminate a selection. So like, let's say I did this with the Alt key held, pushing Enter, I have removed that bit of the selection. And that holds true for the square and circular selection tools as well. A third way to make a selection is with the pen tool. I could make a few points just like before, but if you push and hold, you have this little Bezier curve, which allows you to refine your selection as you're creating it. So again, clicking and holding and dragging will allow you to pull out those handles and make a curve. To close this selection, simply click on your original point and you can close off the shape. Now that's not actually a selection yet. To turn that into a selection, you have to push Control Enter, and that path we just drew with the pen tool has now become a selection. With this one, you can like say make another shape like this, push Alt Control Enter and we can subtract it, or I'll undo, push Shift Control Enter, and we can add to it. And this is just like any other selection, so pressing Control T will bring up scale tools or rotate tools, or if you right click, you can go into distort and distort these handles. You could go into your warp tool and warp it around. Again, once you're happy with this, push Enter. Notice once again my background color is by default filled in with that green. For the same reason, the green is my background color here. This will change as we start introducing layers, which I'll get into a few chapters from now. But one more thing you should know about the selection tool. Let's just make a selection. If I clicked on the move tool again up here, as we know we can move this around, but I now have access to this box, which is show transform controls. I think by default this is actually turned on. I like to turn it off, but when you have show transform controls, you no longer have to press Control T to bring up these handles. It'll automatically be there. So you can make any selection, click on the move tool, and have these controls active. Another handy tool for making selections is this, the Magic Wand tool. And essentially what it does is you click and it samples all the similar colors that you clicked on. So in this case, I clicked on white and it selected all the white. If you only want to select connected colors, click on this contiguous box, click the white, and it only selects connected areas of white. If you want more, you can hold Shift, click that bit of white, hold Shift, click that bit of white. You could Alt click and subtract that bit of white. You get the idea. And these are now selections. So for instance, if I want to paint into them, I could just paint into them like we've seen before. And to deselect that, I could push Control D, or I could go up to Select, Deselect. If you click and hold the Magic Wand tool, you can get to this Quick Selection tool. What this does is it uses Photoshop's internal intelligence to kind of figure out what you want to select. So if I click and drag my mouse, it kind of knows that I'm trying to select this monster character. This is not going to be perfect, but it's actually surprisingly a good tool. And then maybe from here I can just move it around or do whatever else I would do with a selection. Let's move on to the Paint Bucket tool, which is right here. You find an area, click, and it fills it with your foreground color, which is that front color right there. The main thing to consider here is this tolerance value. You notice it didn't get some of these white pixels. Well, if I change the tolerance to say 35 and try it again, it does a better job at getting some of those similarly colored pixels. If you set the tolerance to say 1, that means that the pixel has to be an exact match of where you clicked. I guess these pixels here are different or a different white than these ones, so it didn't fill them in. The paint bucket tool is classically used for filling in flat colors in line drawings, for example. Me being more a painterly artist, I really don't use it that much in my work. I'm mostly using the brush tool and stuff like that. One tool I do use a lot of though is the gradient tool. If you click and hold on the paint bucket, you have access to the gradient tool. With the gradient tool, you essentially click and drag on your image and it fills it with a gradient. The two colors the gradient tool uses are your foreground and background color. So if I change this green to like a blue color and did it again, you would have this result. You can change the pattern of your gradient right here. So this would create a circular gradient. This would create some kind of weird star-like gradient. Let's go back to this one though. If you click on here, you have different types of gradients you could do. Like this one takes your foreground color and preserves the actual image it's on. And this is the kind of mode I like to use. Not this exact one, but I like to go up here and click on this one here. You see that checkerboard? That's Photoshop's language for transparent. Whenever you see a checkerboard like that, it means transparent. So this one allows me to just use my foreground color and fade it into transparency. And this becomes very useful, especially when combined with, say, a selection. So let me just quickly and very sloppily select out the hair using the freehand lasso tool up here. I'll go into my gradient. I'll hold Alt and pick a white color. All these are tools we've seen before. And I will gradient down, and I can lighten up the head this way. And that reminds me, one thing I should show you. You see these moving lines? Photoshop users call that marching ants. It can be very distracting, so let me undo that gradient. If you want your selection to be active but not see those marching ants, you can hide the marching ants by pushing Ctrl H. Now, if I do that gradient again, the selection is still there. I can push Ctrl H to turn it back on. It's just we don't see that annoying marching ants animation. So a lot of times what I'll do is use a selection tool like this in conjunction with the gradient tool, but I will almost always push Ctrl H to hide it so I can just see, how it's affecting my image. And there are many ways a gradient tool can interact with your picture. I'll get into those methods in the layers chapter coming up. Okay, the clone tool is that guy right there. What this enables you to do is clone parts of your image over to other parts. So let's say I want this blue highlight on the fur to continue over here. Go to the area you'd like to clone from, hold Alt and sample it by clicking, then go to the area you'd like to clone to and simply paint. So what it's doing here is it started where I sampled, but it got the mouth because I moved my cursor up when I was painting and it got the mouth. So what I like to do is pick here, clone, resample, clone, and I can take, pixels from here and put it here. And when you're just holding your mouse, it actually gives you a preview as to what you are about to clone. So let's say I sampled this tooth. You can see it's going to show me where that tooth is going to go. Then of course, when you press your tablet to paint, it'll paint it. Now I've got a double-mouthed creature, which is too creepy, so I'll hit undo. The clone tool by default is a very soft round brush, but it can interact with other brushes as well. All right, moving on, I'm really excited to show you the smudge tool, which is right there. This is one of my favorite tools in Photoshop. I paint with it a lot. It essentially lives up to its name and smudges the picture, almost like using your fingers with wet oil or acrylic paint or something. Now there are a couple settings I want to adjust. The first is the strength up here. I like to set this high, like say 96 or something. And just with that alone, we could do more aggressive smudging or blending. You could bring in your brushes window and pick any brush to become a smudge tool brush. This is really nice. It preserves kind of the hairs of the brush itself. Now, one thing to note is that I'm not actually painting any color with this. I'm simply smudging the paint that's already on the canvas. However, if I'd like to paint with color, I'll get my color picker open here. I'll pick a bright orangey yellow color. I could turn on this finger painting box and watch this. Now that allows me to paint with the color I have selected, but it slowly runs out as I paint and becomes more of a smudgy tool. I'll pick a different color here to show you. It begins almost as a brush tool with that color, but then fades away and becomes a smudge brush. And I find that different brushes preserve the color differently. Like this brush doesn't even appear to have that much purple to begin with at all, whereas other brushes really load itself up. Like this one has a lot of that purple. So you can play with brushes in conjunction with the smudge tool. But yeah, the smudge tool is a favorite of mine. If you go back to the brushes menu and click and hold it, there is this thing called a mixer brush tool. Mixer brush tool is largely the same. You can pick a brush and paint with it, and it really does the same thing. I'm going to differentiate between the regular brush tool and the mixer brush tool more in the brushes section. One last thing I did want to mention, as almost an addendum to the interface section, if you bring up window history This is kind of like an interactive undo feature. It lists a bunch of my actions that I've done previous. So like I just did a whole bunch of smudge tool work, right? Like I can click back. It's almost like an advanced Control-Z undo. I'm going back through time. If I were up here, I could just push Control-Z, and as you can see, it one by one goes through, but this is just a quicker way to do it. This window might be best if it's docked like that, so I can have my color box open and always go to the history window here. And with that, let's now move on to Krita and check out its tool set.